The storm had been pressing against the Brazilian coast since before midnight, thickening as the Príncipe de Asturias made her way toward São Paulo. Wind rattled the bridge windows, and sheets of rain blurred the horizon until sky and ocean looked like a single gray wall. Captain José Lotina stood over the chart table, listening to the ship's timbers strain with each swell. The immigrants packed below deck had no idea how close they already were to land. The officer on watch had tried twice to spot the beam from the Ponta da Pirabura lighthouse, but the storm swallowed every trace of it. With dawn approaching, the crew needed a position fix that the weather refused to give. The ship had been at sea for weeks, carrying families from Spain and migrants from across Europe who hoped for better lives in Argentina and Brazil. Children slept in narrow bunks. Mothers clutched papers and bags, waiting for the morning when they would finally set foot in the new world they had imagined for months. The engines kept their steady rhythm as the ship pushed through swells, and the low hum of machinery settled over the decks like a familiar blanket. Nothing about the early hours suggested the catastrophe that lay ahead. The only warning was the visibility. No shoreline, no lighthouse, no break in the rain. Around 4 a.m., the captain ordered a slight course change to bring the ship closer to the coast. The charts showed scattered reefs, but he believed they were still miles offshore. Deep in the hull, crewmen worked through their routines, checking pumps and preparing for landfall. The storm masked the subtle shifts in wind and current that were nudging the ship toward danger. The Príncipe de Asturias was moving faster than anyone realized, her bow cutting blind through water that hid a maze of shoals rising sharply from the seafloor. At 4:15 a.m., the lookout leaned forward into the rain and opened his mouth to shout, but the impact hit first. The hull struck the submerged reef with a tearing sound that carried through every deck. Metal screamed as steel plates buckled. People were thrown from bunks and benches, crates toppled, dishes smashed. The ship lurched to port, shuddered violently, and then began to settle by the bow. Below deck, passengers woke to the sound of rushing water echoing through the corridors like a fast-moving river. The reef had ripped open a massive gash near the cargo holds. Seawater poured in with a force strong enough to slam doors shut and knock crew members off their feet. Men in the lower compartments fought to climb ladders as the water surged past them. Some made it through narrow passages. Others were swallowed instantly. Pumps couldn't keep up with the flooding. In minutes, the forward compartments were completely underwater. Captain Lotina tried to maneuver the vessel off the shoal, but the damage was catastrophic. The bow was sinking too quickly, the weight of the incoming water dragging the ship downward. The list increased, tilting the decks hard enough that passengers had to grab railings to stay upright. Lamps flickered overhead, then brightened, then dimmed again as seawater shorted the electrical systems. Crew members shouted orders, but the engine room was already flooding. Steam hissed from ruptured pipes as engineers struggled to escape. Panic spread across the passenger decks. Families rushed toward the companionways, children crying as water streamed down the stairwells. Crew members tried to organize lifeboat launches, but the list made it nearly impossible. The boats on the port side were already unusable, hanging at angles too steep to lower safely. On the starboard side, a few crewmen tried to free the ropes, but waves slammed against the hull, making the davits jerk unpredictably. Passengers crowded around the boats in desperation, but the ship was losing stability too fast for any organized evacuation. The bow dipped lower, pulling the forward deck under the surface. Water swept across the midship area, knocking people off their feet. Survivors later said the ship seemed to inhale one last time before it plunged. Some felt the deck buckle beneath them. Others heard a deep rumble as the boilers met the rising seawater, sending columns of steam through the air. The brief flash of light from the electrical shorting convinced a few witnesses that an explosion had taken place, a detail that would later confuse early reports. 5 minutes after striking the reef, the Príncipe de Asturias disappeared beneath the surface. Hundreds of people were pulled under with it, trapped inside cabins or caught in the suction created by the sinking hull. When the surface finally cleared, wreckage bobbed in the rain-darkened water, broken planks, floating luggage, fragments of the superstructure. The cries of the survivors carried through the wind as they clung to whatever debris they could reach. The storm made rescue nearly impossible. Survivors drifted in clusters, fighting exhaustion and waves that pushed them toward the rocks. Some were badly injured. Others were half-conscious, trying to keep hold of their children or loved ones. Hours passed before fishermen from nearby São Sebastião Island spotted bodies and debris. They rowed out through the swells, hauling survivors into their boats one by one. By the time larger vessels arrived, the sea had already claimed most of the victims. In the following days, bodies washed ashore along the coastline. Many were never identified. The passenger list had been incomplete, and records were inconsistent. Newspapers reported wildly different numbers. Some said 600 aboard, others closer to 900. What investigators did agree on was that more than 400 people died, making it one of the worst maritime disasters in Brazilian history. Yet the tragedy faded from public memory almost immediately. World War I dominated headlines, and stories from distant coasts rarely circulated far. Families who had waited at ports across South America for relatives never received clear answers. The wreck remained on the reef, visited only by currents, and the occasional diver who confirmed the hull had torn open exactly where survivors had described. The Príncipe de Asturias was a modern liner for her time, but no ship could have survived the collision that morning. The combination of darkness, storm conditions, and a slight navigational error placed her on a deadly path toward the shoals. For the passengers below deck, immigrants carrying documents, keepsakes, and the hope of new beginnings, the catastrophe took everything before most of them had even reached the stairs. More than a century later, the disaster is remembered quietly, overshadowed by larger ocean tragedies. But along the coast of São Paulo, fishermen still speak of the night the sea glowed with scattered wreckage and the cries of survivors drifted across the waves. Thank you for listening to The Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.